Welcome to Early Matters, the podcast on the science and policy of early childhood, hosted by Dr. Katharine B. Stevens. Early Matters features in-depth conversations with leading researchers, practitioners, and policy experts on what matters most for young children and their families to thrive.
Welcome back to Early Matters. I'm Katharine Stevens, your host and the founder and CEO of the Center on Child and Family Policy. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Arthur Rolnick, who many listeners will know as a giant in the field of early childhood. Art is an economist who's been on the faculty at the University of Minnesota since 2010. He previously served as co-director of the Human Capital Research Collaborative at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, and before that, worked for 40 years at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis as a senior vice president and director of research. His main expertise is in pre-Civil War banking. But today, I'm excited to talk with him about his decades of work in early childhood, and especially the Minnesota Early Learning Scholarships Program, which he launched about 20 years ago in Minneapolis. Art, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Katharine.
So I want to start by asking you, you're an economist, your focus is Civil War banking. What has led you to care about early childhood?
Well, I can tell you it wasn't my work in pre-Civil War banking that led me there. It was all sort of by accident. A group of us would get together. This is going back roughly 20 years. A group of us would get together for lunch, and we would invite somebody with a passion. It could be an author. It could be an academic. It could be a media person. And this particular lunch, an organization called Ready for Kindergarten, their executive director, a man by the name of Todd Otis, was making a pitch for more state funding in early childhood education. And I listened. I wasn't real happy with his talk. I raised my hand. I tell people that was my first mistake because I said, Todd, you're making a moral argument, and I understand moral arguments. That's fine. But policymakers need more than moral arguments. I mean, you can make a moral argument for investing more in K through 12 and higher education and climate change and in criminal justice system, whatever. I said, I suspect you'll get further in the funding goal if you make an economic case. I'm guessing you can. I'm just guessing. I thought early ed was kindergarten. So, like I said, that was my mistake because that organization was founded by a former governor of Minnesota, Al Quie, a Republican, former mayor of Minneapolis, Don Fraser, a Democrat. And they start calling me up and say, okay, Rolnick, we agree. Come on the board and do the economic analysis. I try to explain to them my expertise was pre-Civil War banking, but hard to say no to them. Fortunately, my directors at the bank said, go for it, Rolnick. As I told them it would only take me a few months. I was pretty sure that there's a literature out there that we could go to and take an economic lens to it and see if we can make the case. I wasn't sure we could make the case, but I said we give it a try. Young colleague of mine, Rob Grunwald, who was my education outreach person, I figured he knew something about it. I said, Rob, I've committed us to doing that research. And that's how we got started.
So one of the arguments that you made at the outset, if I understand correctly, is sort of two parts. One, you were thinking about early childhood in terms of human capital development.
Correct.
And as a sensible target for economic development, part one. Part two, in contrast with conventional approaches to economic development, which you have been very critical of. Can you just explain those two pieces of this picture?
Sure. Let me start with what we dubbed the economic bidding war among states, bidding for sports stadiums, for manufacturing factories, for jobs, if you will. And this has been going on for decades in this country, maybe back to the beginning. I think it actually may have started with Alexander Hamilton. And the idea is if we could bring a sports stadium, a factory to our city, our state, it would create jobs. There'd be spillover effects. It'd be great for our economy. So like Minnesota, for example, might compete with Wisconsin. Well, clearly from a national perspective, having these states competing this way doesn't create any new jobs. It just relocates them. I understand it from the local point of view, but it doesn't make any economic sense. It's a zero public return. In fact, we argued economically it makes no sense, and legally it violates the Commerce Clause that said cities and states aren't supposed to be interfering. So before I got into the early childhood space, I was going around the country. In fact, we got a bill introduced in Congress that would have, again, based on the law and the economics, would have ended that bidding war. I won't go into those details, but never got anywhere because there's a lot of money to be made here. And the sports teams in particular, they get billions of dollars public money for these stadiums. They'd build those stadiums anyway, anywhere, believe me, and just a question of location. So I would then say that I go around the country and making these arguments to various political leaders and in Congress, and they'd say, okay, Rolnick, if these bidding wars is the wrong way to promote an economy, what should we be doing? Back then, I'd have a fairly straightforward answer based on a whole lot of economic research. Invest in human capital, invest in job training and education, et cetera. You'll get a real return there, not a zero. You'll get a real return. And I pointed to Minnesota, who over the last 50, 60 years became one of the strongest economies in the country because they poured money into education. And we have one of the most highly educated workforces in the country. And that's why we have so many, on a per capita basis, Fortune 500 companies. Believe me, it's not the Minnesota Vikings that attract these businesses. It is our workforce. So human capital was clearly an issue for me that I thought makes a lot of sense for economic development. When I got in the early childhood space, I said, I think we should start thinking about investing in early childhood as economic development, not simply a moral argument, not simply an equity issue. There are lots of other reasons, but I'm an economist, and I'm going to say, look, guys, if these kids succeed in school, and I'm talking in particular about low income kids born into poverty, kids born into incarcerated parents, kids that are in families that are homeless, if these kids start school ready, there's research to show they're much more likely to succeed in school, be productive citizens. Crime rate goes down dramatically. So my line here is if we invest in these kids early, and it turned out early is important, they're much more likely to go to college than join a gang. It's as simple as that. And so that's where I went from the economic bidding war, these public subsidies that go to private companies, which from, again, a national perspective make no sense. Let's invest in our kids.
So these things all came together in the launching of what started, I believe, as a pilot project.
Correct.
Of what was called the Minnesota Early Learning Scholarships. Can you describe what that is, how that got started, and what was the impetus for starting that, and what it is?
So our first essay, our first report that Rob Grunwald and I put out, we looked at the Perry Preschool, which is one of the famous longitudinal studies. There's a number of these. They basically get the same result. Then it was about 123 families randomly divided into two groups, but they had a control group. This is Ypsilanti, Michigan in the early 60s. Somebody said, maybe we're starting kindergarten is too late for our most at-risk children. So they had 123 poverty families, randomly divide the group into two. And we had the data. This is 30 years worth of data. We had, or 40 years actually, worth of data. And we looked at the first 15 years, and Perry Preschool looked like it was a failure because the IQ went up for the kids who had the good program. They had a high quality program. It was master level teachers, home visits, working with the parent. And then there's the control group that didn't get the program. And while after 15 years, the IQ went up, but then it went back down. So Perry Preschool kind of looked like a failure. But then 30, 40 years worth of data, we had outcomes. Like I said earlier, these kids, if they start school already, the Perry Preschool kids didn't need special ed, were not retained in a grade, were much more likely to be literate by the sixth grade, graduate high school, get a job, pay taxes. Poverty rate went down 50%. And we took an economic lens to it, and we said, okay, what business people would ask or what economists would ask, what was the return on the investment? And we had the data. We could put dollar values on the benefits that I just mentioned, The cost was about $10,000 in today's dollars, $10,000 per year, 2-year program, $20,000 cost. That data, you can actually back out the implied rate of return. I said to Rob, if we could beat 6%, we could go back to the governor and the mayor and say, it's a good economic investment. Why 6%? Post-World War II, U.S. stock market, on average, the annual return was 6%. So we're going to take money out of the market. I would argue you got to make a case you can beat the market. So I was going to be happy with 8%. We got an 18% inflation-adjusted return. Actually, I told Rob I didn't believe that number. That looked too high. Please go back and redo it. He did it 3 or 4 times, still got 18%. I decided to send all this data to James Heckman, Nobel laureate at the University of Chicago, who was looking at the same studies at the same time. I said, Jim, please look at this, check it. A month later, I get a very cryptic note from Jim, 18%. Now, he's gone in a little deeper than we did on some of this, the data, and revised it. He's still got double-digit returns. We still get a very strong return. So when I was speaking on this, I was in Boston speaking on this issue, and a fella came up to me and said, well, I really like what you're doing. It's great. The Perry Preschool is very convincing. But for the most at-risk kids, 3 and 4-year-olds, and this was for 3 and 4-year-olds, you're starting too late. I didn't know what he meant by that. This was Jack Shunkoff, author of Neurons to Neighborhoods, and he educated me on how much the neuroscientists have learned about brain development. So he knew we were going to do a second essay proposing a policy. That is, now that you have the results, what are you going to do? So the real challenge is here. We want whatever policy we propose, it should be targeted at the most at risk. The research is pretty clear. Once you get well above poverty, the return's much less, if anything. It's mostly the poverty kids that are behind when they start school, and that's where the problems are. So it's got to be a targeted policy approach. It's got to empower the parents. We don't get these kind of results if you don't empower the parents. It's got to start early, okay? It has to be quality. We can talk about what that means, but it can't just be babysitting. And my bottom line, though, a critical challenge is whatever you propose, it's got to be scalable. It can't just be a specific person who's doing a great job. If we're an 18% return, any business person would fully fund this overnight. So the obvious thing to us, a couple of economists, use the market, power the parents, provide the parents with an early learning scholarship. It was pretty simple. Yeah, they have to use it at a quality program. You're going to say to me, well, what about what Jack Shunkoff said, 3 or 4 is too early? Well, we added to that scholarship plus parent mentor starting prenatal. This is almost as much about health as it is about education. And it's critical that a child is born full weight, full term, not addicted. And working with mentoring the parent is so important those first years. So our program, which we call the Minnesota Model for Early Learning. Now, I was making a talk like this back in Minnesota to the United Way executive board, and the man by the name of Warren Staley, who was CEO of Cargill, said to me, okay, Rolnick, that sounds good in theory. Let's get you out of that ivory tower at the Federal Reserve, and let's do a pilot. I said, Warren, that's great. Now, he's CEO of Cargill. He sets up this foundation, this nonprofit. I go to the first meeting. He puts me on the board. And who's at the table? The CEO of Best Buy, Ecolab, General Mills, the president of the University of Minnesota, a man by the name of Charlie Weaver, who was former chief of staff for Tim Pawlenty. And he was heading the business partnership that represented 120 businesses. So it was a very business-oriented nonprofit that said, let's do the pilot. The pilot was very simple. We circled a low-income community in St. Paul, and we raised $20 million. How did we raise $20 million? Well, Warren Staley said, Cargill's in for $5 million, guys. What are you in for? It wasn't quite that easy, but we raised $20 million. We did this pilot, and the pilot was basically handing out scholarship, mentor the Minnesota model to well over 400 families. And they chose to use this. They could use it at Head Start. They could use it at Montessori. They could use it at faith-based, but it had to be a quality program. And we also created a rating system. It's called Parent Aware. And I was a little concerned that we don't want to micromanage these, overregulate these firms. Ultimately, and we're not quite there yet, we're going to judge firms not just on inputs. We want quality teachers, et cetera. But we're going to look at outputs. That is, how many children in their program start school ready. And we have an assessment that's very effective. It's not rocket science to assess whether a child is cognitively and emotionally ready for school. And the parents, when they choose a program, they will have the data. Working with the mentors, they'll know how successful these programs are and what kind of programs they are. We argued one size doesn't fit all. It might be Montessori. It might be music-based. We have a program that they sing to the kids all day. Let the parents figure out what works best for them and the kids. That's the Minnesota model. That's the early scholarship model. We've had a lot of success with that. We're up to 15,000 children, and we're getting incredible results. And the state just gave us $500 million. A good chunk of that is going to early learning scholarships and mentors as we go forward in the next couple of years.
I just want to highlight some of the elements that you've just described that I have for, I guess I've first connected with you, I don't know how long, 10 years ago, or no, not 10, maybe 8, some long period of time, right?
Right.
What I have loved so much about the Minnesota model for early learning is that it provides such a strong model for implementing new early childhood programs and expanding early childhood programs. That, and this is something I've heard you, well, several elements. One is you've said that target the children who need help the most, that it's driven by parent choice, and that's highly scalable because you're putting the resources in the hands of parents, which means it doesn't require large new government programs, big new government apparatus. You're essentially, instead of scaling programs, you're scaling parents' capacity to do what's right for their own children. And I've heard you say before that another absolutely key element of this, the sort of the theory of this approach, is that demand drives supply, not the other way around. Can you say something about what you mean by that?
Sure. When we started the pilot, I had lots of critics. One major critic said, look, guys, this area, low-income area, they don't have 4-star rated they don't have pre-K programs. I mean, it's a poverty area. I said, well, wait. We're going to drive it with demand. That is, these parents are going to have scholarships, and our scholarships actually paid up to $12,000 a year. Once the market hears about this, they're going to respond. Now, as an economist, it seems natural for us. We want to use the power of the market. But I admit, we're taking a risk. It's possible nothing would develop out of this. Well, within 6 months, every one of our parents found a 3 or a 4-star rated program. We made a 3 or 4-star rated program. How did that happen? Well, the market heard that these parents have scholarships. So the public schools expanded their program. Montessori expanded their program. Head Start expanded their program. New Horizon, which is a private for-profit, they opened up a brand new facility in that community. We had parents in tears. They had never had anything in that community. So demand drove the market, if you will. We didn't have to, from top down, decide how many buildings we need, how many classrooms we need, how teachers are. The market does that for you. That's the power of the market. So we had to empower the parent, and it's so critical. The other thing I remember that criticism, it better be culturally sensitive. Well, shortly after New Horizon opened in this community, if you had gone into their school, they opened this brand new school, beautiful playground. You'd go into the classroom and there was Hmong culture all around the rooms. Now, why was that? Well, most of the parents, their customers, if you will, were Hmong. And they knew that if they wanted to keep their customers happy and not going to Montessori or to Head Start, they better be culturally sensitive. So the market even took care of that problem. So fortunately, we were able to respond to the critics with evidence. And the evidence was, yeah, the market will work. Yeah, there's going to be places that initially don't have the infrastructure. But if these parents are empowered with resources, now, our parents don't get money, they get a letter, and then we have an organization that partners with the state. It's called Think Small. The state gives us scholarship money, and we recruit the parents. And if you're one of the parents and you go to Montessori, Montessori bills us. So it's very transparent, and we've had a lot of success in we got waiting lists. People ask, how do you recruit the parents? It's actually, once the word gets out, it was pretty quick that we had waiting lists. And so we had the pilot, we had to shut down after we ran out of money, which was good. It said, because some other critics said to me, oh, these parents are so disengaged, they won't even apply. Well, that's a lot of baloney. Parents care. I don't care their income. I don't care their race. I don't care their background. They care about their children, and you give them this opportunity, and they flourish as well as their kids. That's something we really didn't have the data on the impact on the parents and the siblings and the family. And now it's anecdotal, we've got a lot of testimony on how this program changes the parents' life, the mother in particular. Some of our mothers, single parents, are going back to school, back to work. So there's other benefits that go along with this program. So the unintended good consequences that occur when you empower these parents.
So it sounds like, this notion of putting parents and children rather than programs at the center, empowering parents, is core to what makes this successful.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is that correct?
Yeah, and we know that from the science. With Jack Shunkoff and the neuroscientists, that interaction with the parent and that child in the very earliest years is critical for that. So getting that parent engaged, and I would argue human interaction, we know generally is important for a whole lot of things, but that parent interaction. So we kind of know that empowering that parent works with that relationship, but we also know it makes the market works that way. And so it's a twofer, if you will.
Right. Right. So one of the things I don't know if you see it this way, but in my observation, I met you shortly after I had started working in early childhood in 2014. And at that time, making the argument that early childhood programs, that early learning mattered, was a really central focus. And we seem to have moved past that. My observation is that on all sides of the aisle, at different levels of the population and government, people have really come to accept that early childhood matters a lot. So that is a giant win. One of the things that worries me that I wanted to get your thoughts on is our decades of experience with K-12 schooling has made it very clear that how something is implemented makes a very big difference. So an amazing second grade classroom, a high quality second grade classroom, provides what I imagine and some analysis could find as a very high return on investment. A low quality second grade classroom might have a negative impact. So one of the things that's concerning me is that as this idea that early childhood matters, that early childhood programs can make a very big difference, has become really central in policy focus, there's a strong inclination to essentially replicate the K-12 approach down to infancy, meaning that money goes to programs rather than parents, and that the government is put in kind of the central role of making decisions about what programs are sort of in and what programs are out. The government is put in an overly central role, sort of the more powerful role, like in K-12. And what I find so exciting about the Minnesota model is it, to me, provides a really concrete example of a scalable approach that puts parents and children at the center and is kind of infinitely scalable given resources. And then just adding one thing to that, the other thing that I'm observing happening is K-12 is, long time, K-12 is universal. And public funds go to fund the education of poor kids and rich kids and anyone in between. There's a strong advocacy argument now to bring that approach to early childhood. And along with that, the return on investment argument is often cited as applying to universal programs. This worries me because I worry that ensuring high quality for low income kids and empowering low income parents is potentially compromised by a universal kind of government run focus, which is what we've seen in K-12. So that's a very long thought, but I would love your ideas on all that.
Well, first, let me comment on universal pre-K. It's something Heckman and I have both argued against, that the research shows, and it's pretty clear, and this is not just U.S. now, there's international research to show that what we call our high return children are children who are born into poverty, born at risk, and start way behind. Once you get to middle and upper middle class kids, there is no return to that. These kids start with a good environment. They start school ready. There isn't a problem with school readiness. In my neighborhood out here in the western suburbs of Minnesota, these kids do very well, thank you. So some argue for universal pre-K. That's not a good use of public money. I would rather have them invest public money in a whole lot of other things or lower taxes. There are better ways to use it than finance Bill Gates' grandchildren or something for pre-K. So, but let me just say, I'm not in the K through 12 space. I really don't know that literature. I know Minnesota is, I would argue, the home to charter schools, and a dear friend of mine is considered in Minnesota, the grandmother of charter schools. I don't know the research. I just don't know it. But I do know this. And this is a North Carolina example, a study. It turns out North Carolina, like Minnesota, has a very large achievement gap, that poverty kids start well behind in school and they stay behind. That's true in North Carolina, just like in Minnesota, even though Minnesota is supposed to be the education state. That's not true for our poverty kids. We fail them. Anyways, in Georgia, 20% of the poverty schools, these researchers found there was no achievement gap. Third grade, these kids were performing as well as the majority kids. Now, that was interesting. And the researchers went in, they talked to the superintendents, they talked to the principals, they talked to the teachers. What made the difference? Not surprising, Catherine. They said they are all aligned with a high quality pre-K program that the parents have chosen. So kind of like the Minnesota model, they went to a high quality program, and sure enough, but one of the fallouts, one of the unintended good consequences, teacher turnover went way down. Now, I used to teach in inner city Detroit years ago, and I can tell you when the kids came in and they barely knew their name, I failed. But when I had one class where these kids were really top notch, and I claimed I was the best teacher in the school then, of course. So I'm going to argue, I don't know how to fix the problems in K through 12. I'm not claiming I do. But if we succeed with these kids in pre-K and all the kids start school ready, these teachers, the young teachers, are going to be able to teach. There's going to be much less need for special ed, and they're going to thrive, and they're going to now like what they're doing, and they're not going to leave right away. So organically, this will improve the public schools. Now, again, I believe that we need to get the parents engaged. I like the idea that the charter schools force the other schools to compete for the parents and stuff. Economists like competition. That's where I start. But I don't know that research. I don't know what difference it makes. What I do know, though, when it comes to these poverty kids, we can improve the public schools dramatically, especially in poverty communities, by making sure these kids start school ready, cognitively, emotionally, and healthy, ready to learn, and these parents are engaged. It will change. I'm going to claim there's a good chance these schools will get significantly better. That's the best I can say from what I know. If you can ask me about pre-Civil War banking, I can go deeper into that issue. K through 12, I'm just, believe me, well over my pay scale.
So another, when you say pre-K, Art, this is something else that I have really loved about the emphasis of the Minnesota model. You literally mean pre-kindergarten, which includes prenatal, right? I mean,
it does include prenatal.
Right.
It's prenatal to 5. Yes,
right.
absolutely.
So in other words, because a lot of in many sort of arenas these days, when one says pre-K, one really means children start school when they're 4 instead of when they're 5.
Yeah.
right? And that's not what you're talking about. To me, that's something so impressive about the direction that you and your colleagues have taken the Minnesota program. I think when I met you, you guys weren't even at the point of working with prenatal.
No.
And I think the parent coaches may also be new. Can you talk more about how that came about and how that's affected the overall success of the approach?
Well, my wife is an epidemiologist. And when I started in this field, she started hammering on me. She says this is going to be as much about health as it is about education. And I dug into David Old's work on home visiting nurses, and he had some amazing studies showing if you start at birth. Then I was up at Native American reservation up north in Minneapolis, and the elders who were really involved in starting a high quality early ed program, they told me that year close to half the kids were born addicted. So it struck me, clearly we have to start prenatal to get to these moms and work with the community to identify the moms, work with the school nurses, work with various community programs to identify these kids and get to them early. We have programs that do that today. And by the way, our programs, we've got the data, our kids are born full weight, full term, not addicted, and our teenage moms are not getting pregnant again. We're showing some amazing results. So yes, and I probably shouldn't use the word pre-K. I should use the word early childhood development. And it's prenatal to 5, let's just say it that way. So that's a better way. I think it's better language because, yeah, you're right. Pre-K, people think 4 or 3, and that's fine. But the highest return by far is starting at the very beginning, starting prenatal.
Yes. And then the other thing I think about the term pre-K that people think the year before, 2 before kindergarten, and they also think school.
Yeah.
And human development goes considerably beyond school, even for kindergartners. But it sounds as though, as over the past 2 decades of working on this, the program has continued to expand its understanding of human development and what's required for the kinds of returns that were kind of the rationale in the first place.
Yeah, and I think I owe a big debt to Jack Shunkoff, who educated me on how critical the early years of brain development are, and how critical the interaction between the parent and the child is. So yeah, education obviously starts at home. We as a society haven't, I think, understood that and invested in that as we should, especially clearly with our low-income families. So once I got into that space, I realized that it has to be a prenatal to 5 program, and it means not just school. That's part of it. The pre-K is the school part. The home visitor that becomes part of the family, and that's what we find out. These home visitors are just amazing people, and they kind of adopt the family, and the family adopts them. And a lot of these parents tell me they've never had anybody, had their back. Well, they can call these home visitors up 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. If there's a medical emergency or whatever, they've got their back. And it just means a lot to these families. And you empower the parent, give them some confidence, they blossom. So like I said, our return on investment didn't include, the impact on the parent. And so a critical part of our program is the home visitor. It's not just the scholarship, it is both. And like you say, this is not just about school. And that's why this is not simply let the public schools do this. This has got to be a parent-focused program. And as you say, we can scale it very easily. It's not difficult to scale this model. We're doing this in Minnesota. We're doing it in a number of other states now. We've got about 12 states that have something like the Minnesota model. And it's relatively easy to scale, very low administrative costs, and also very transparent. And so there's a lot of things we like. And now, if you got a better program, I'm open to it. No one has come up with a better program that I've seen yet that could match the challenges here. And again, one of the big challenges is to empower the parent, and the other is scalable, efficient way of scaling.
So when you say it's scalable, can you just say a little bit more about why? What makes it scalable? What makes this approach scalable?
Because we use the market. We don't have to decide how many buildings, how many teachers, where they should be located. The market does that for you. The parents essentially If it's a low-income area that has all these scholarships, so they'll essentially demand the programs in their community, and that's what happens. Now, I should say our scholarship, if you live in a low-income community, but you work out in the western suburbs, you can take your child with you to work and go into a Montessori program out there. The scholarship goes with the parent. If the parent leaves, scholarship goes with the parent. But the reason it's so scalable is there's a lot of decisions the market makes for us. The only decision we have to do is find the parent, and sign them up. Basically, there just isn't much. I mean, obviously we have to pay the provider once the parent chooses that, but all that is relatively easy and straightforward to do to bring to scale because we empower the parents, which means we use the market. The market solves many of these things for us. When I first got into this, I was talking to the bureaucrats who started all these diagrams on how they're going to, manage and build a system. I said, you don't have to build a system. It'll happen organically. I like that word organic. It happens with the market. So my argument is because we use the market, it's very easy to scale, relatively easy to almost any other program to scale.
So one of the effects of early childhood kind of getting onto the map, as it has, is there's a lot of focus at the federal level on this, on both sides of the aisle, kind of an openness to spending potentially a lot more money, doing new things. So I'm wondering, what do you think? What are the implications of this program for the federal government, and what do you think the role of the federal government should be, if any, in this arena?
Well, it's not going to surprise you what I'm going to say. I want them to adopt the Minnesota model and provide financial incentives to adopt that model and maybe do a matching. The state comes up with $500 million and the government and the federal government another $500 million to fully fund this. And by the way, this is one program that over time, I admit it'll take 20 years or so, you can decrease the program because Heckman has shown the children of the children are more likely to succeed. So we will have less need for this program as we move along. But I would like the federal government to provide an incentive. They have a Race to the Top grant. And years ago, I happened to have dinner with Rahm Emanuel and talked about, he asked what he could do. And I said, well, you got a Race to the Top grant. You provide incentives for K through 12. Why don't you put some money in for early childhood and for an innovative program? And we have an innovative program. He did that. And that's how we were able to initially to take that pilot program. We got another 30 million and we spread it around the state. So we were able to enlarge that. And eventually that got us state money. And like I said, this last session, we got $500 million for early childhood. A good chunk of that goes directly to our program.
So I want to ask a downside, upside question. What over the last 10, 20 years working on this, have you found most frustrating? What's most frustrating about working in this, or what you see is or is not happening?
What was frustrating, and I think as an economics profession, we generally have failed to explain the power of market and how to use it. Doesn't mean markets don't need to be regulated. But I was frustrated when I first presented these ideas. All my critics was, oh, that's not going to work. We don't have 4-star programs. We don't have, teachers. We don't have rooms. And the bureaucracy keeps thinking top down. And it was very frustrating, especially initially, to try to convince people that, no, the market will work. The pilot clearly helped a lot because it demonstrated. Now, it was great to have the business community behind it and saying this is our future workforce. Let's make sure we invest well. But I found that the most frustrating as an economist, living in a market-based economy, to have to explain to people that, no, markets aren't bad, they're good. I'm not saying they don't need to be regulated, but understanding how to use the market, it'll solve a lot of our problems. And this is a good example. I would say that was my biggest frustration. Now, over time, because we had the data, we had the evidence that this program works and the market does respond, it's been very satisfying that my critics have kind of conceded, okay, we don't have to do universal public school only, even though some states are doing that. They're regretting it. They're finding some real problems with what they're doing. Like they're just doing 4-year-olds. That's too late. They're spending a lot of money for middle and upper middle class kids and not focusing on the at-risk. They're not getting the at-risk parents engaged. They're not starting early enough. So that's frustrating. But I will say this, going around the country, there are many, many communities that are adopting this approach.
So the flip side of frustrating, looking forward, what are you most excited about or hopeful about looking sort of about now and over the next few years?
Well, I think the most rewarding thing for me, I was in Arizona, not in Minnesota, in the winter when the hearings we have a budget surplus, how to spend it. And on the hearings on early ed, I heard both sides of the aisle citing this work, saying, this is really a good investment. That was, to me, that's a big win. And there is a commitment. There is a commitment that the state of Minnesota will bring this to scale. We're going to be close to 60-70% of the kids for the next 2 years. We're going to gather the results to show we need to continue. And I'm much more confident today that we'll reach the ultimate goal, that every child born into poverty, every child born of an incarcerated parent, every child born homeless will have this program and will succeed and have a much better chance in life of succeeding, not just benefiting the child, but benefiting our community, benefiting our economy. This is a good chunk of our future workforce. If they don't get educated, we got serious economic problems, not just social problems.
Well, Art, thank you very much. This has been fascinating. I really appreciate your taking the time, and I'm hopeful that the podcast will play a small role in elevating the really enormous significance of the work you've done and its implications for people who care about this issue across the country.
Thank you, Catherine. And we've got a date when you're in town to talk about pre-Civil War banking. Be happy to do it.
Okay, looking forward to it. Thanks, Art. Thanks so much to Art for a wonderful conversation. And thanks to you, our listeners, for joining us today. Please subscribe to the podcast so you're always up to date. Check out CCFP's work at ccfp.org and follow us on Twitter at CCFP and at KB Stevens. We'll see you on the next episode of Early Matters.
You've been listening to Early Matters, the podcast on the science and policy of early childhood, produced by the Center on Child and Family Policy.